The devil that you know rather than the devil you don't know. Society is made up of people, and people seek things that are familiar to them. And with this familiarity comes the sense of safety. Did you know I was personally dragged into the whistleblowing about the sexual abuse, trafficking of vulnerable women at the nonprofit organization with a false accusation by the female central to my story? I had support from some famous people like
One man told me about being beaten by the police and left permanently disabled because of a woman's false allegation.
Hello, it's December 2025. Now the topic of this video is going to be talking about jealousy and how destructive it is socially and with human beings to the human species. Now jealousy can come from anywhere, even people that you don't know, you don't even engage with. You could be, for example, minding your own business, walking down the street, but because you have nicer clothes than someone else, they're jealous. You may, from another person's perspective at least, be driving a nicer vehicle and they're jealous. Or perhaps others can be jealous when you're engaging them in a conversation and you're smarter, you have a greater knowledge base, you're more intelligent, and they become jealous. And then they resort to name calling and trying to dehumanize someone else who is smarter than them. And we really see this, for example, in the comment section of social media posts where somebody is, say, for example, presenting facts, and people who are led by emotions, which is most people, have a jealousy that they can't rebut as well. I was going to interject here for a moment, because simply because someone can be persuasive doesn't mean that they are correct. However, when there's facts involved, that changes everything. Now I digress. But what happens when jealousy is not from someone you don't know or people that you may know as acquaintances or even friends? What if the jealousy is closer to home, dare I say, within the home? Now, when you look at the story of Snow White, the original story is very, very dark. And it has to do with the jealousy of a biological mother and her daughter. Now, historically, from what we can understand and read, there was a big problem with mothers taking their daughters and sons from life because of jealousy. Now, the story of Snow White, for example, focuses on a daughter, and the whole story that, for example, we see in movies and newly rewritten storybooks about Snow White has completely changed from its original meaning. The original story is very dark, and it was a warning and a reminder to preserve the fears that were going on historically, where you'd have, for example, parents taking a child, perhaps even children, from life because of jealousy. And when you actually examine and go into depth of that story of Snow White, it's very shocking. Now, I'm just going to stop here for a moment, because I'm sure, aside from triggering as I have this discussion here, some people, because it's going to be challenging a false narrative that has been really promoted in modern times. But this is going to be maybe challenging, triggering for some people, because as they start to listen, they might recall bad memories from, for example, their childhood. So just be warned here. The story of Snow White has the mother jealous of the daughter and makes 3 attempts to take her from life. And then we get into some really dark twists of this with the prince and everything else. Now, I'm going to use my life as an example here. I'm just trying to think how to wordcraft this, and I just want to make it very clear, this is not a bash towards any family member that I may address right now, but just to simply highlight my firsthand perspective and knowing what it's like. Having, for example, a mother that is jealous of everyone around her, including myself. And these types of people, I do feel sorry for these types of people like my mother, because they project how they think and what they do to others onto others. And when I look at my life, especially when I became older and started to become successful, the jealousy. And there's a lot of other factors that I've shared in some videos about myself about all this. But going through the story of Snow White and reviewing that, it really brought back a lot of memories for myself. Because for myself, I survived abortion. I was born dead for apparently 45 minutes. And the first time I drowned, now I'm not saying or stating or implying anything for a fact, but my mother was there and she said that she didn't see me drowning, which I can't prove either way. But then I also survived being deliberately poisoned for an insurance trust fund. So there's 3 attempts, at least 2, I could say definitely. And this just kind of reminded me when I was reviewing this story of Snow White, the original story. It really hit home for me, I guess you can say. And perhaps others that are watching this can start to say, maybe not to the same degree, but can kind of relate as well. When you have someone in your personal life who you're supposed to trust and love betray you because of jealousy, and they make your life very difficult, well, it makes life even harder and makes you feel even more lonely. Now, for some people who've never experienced this, they're not going to understand, but this type of thing does go on. Now, there was a time in history, this ties into the story of Snow White, where there was a fear primarily of mothers taking their children from life. The story of Snow White focuses on the daughter, and perhaps there's more instances of daughters being taken from life because of jealousy by the mother historically, but boys as well would be in there. And the story of Snow White was to document and remind people in a storybook way what the fears were at the time. And this is supported by documentation through courts and everything else of investigations and so forth. But here we have jealousy from within your own family that is probably more devastating than the jealousy of someone that you don't even know, or maybe you're communicating with online, because they have a very intimate knowledge of you. They know your weaknesses, know your strengths, or they should to some degree anyway. People do change as they age, so the strategies may change, but it's still there. And sometimes parents, a mother, enjoys the torment of their child because it empowers them. And then we get into sociopaths and psychopaths and everything else. But what I'm now getting into here is something that's called malignant narcissism. And there's articles you can read about it and so forth. But the story of Snow White fits that descriptive right down to the letter. Now, this jealousy comes from something external. So, for example, you might have a parent who has never accomplished anything in their lives, and they see everyone around them, their friends and so forth, accomplishing so much. So there's a jealousy, and so they create this narrative in their own mind how or why they haven't been able to succeed, and then projecting that everyone's jealous of them. But if their child succeeds them and becomes successful, that totally breaks down their narrative as to why they didn't succeed, their excuse or excuses. And this comes from, again, external things, other people's success, other people's wealth, other people's looks, possessions, everything else. And we see in today's world, the modern world, how the real focus is materialistic things. But where this really challenges what I was saying before, a false narrative that's been really perpetuated in modern times, is the feminist narrative. How, for example, women historically, are all about love and caring and niceness and everything else. And I've shown over the years, cited sources, even citing specific sources, how false that is. Where, for example, women tend to commit various serious and minor crimes at far higher rates than men. But because of feminism, they project, perhaps out of jealousy. So now we have women, say via feminism, expressing their jealousy and playing victimhood across the board. And it's really interesting, I'm just going to separate for a moment, how the whole feminist narrative of victimhood and so-called victim blaming, they're even applying to topics that have nothing to do with women, perhaps ostriches. And they're saying something to the effect of, in the comment section, victim blame much? That's a feminist jargon right there. That's how much all this has infected society, but I digress. So the whole narrative of women being all about love and softness and kindness and nurturing and everything else is further debunked by the story of Snow White and other stories that were turned into children's stories at the time also support the said. And it's interesting how feminism completely misses that. Perhaps it's because the story of Snow White, continue with this example, hit itself well with it being rewritten and changing the characters and everything else to make it more palatable for society. Because the reality is pretty scary. But there are many people, perhaps just like myself with my childhood, who have experienced their own torment from someone who they love unconditionally and trusted. So my point is, I'm not the only one. There are many others like that. Perhaps you yourself watching this video. So it debunks that narrative, the feminist narrative. And when we look at jealousy overall, it destroys society because people want, and we see in religions and belief systems stories of jealousy, where you even have angelics who are jealous of each other, or even jealous of the Most High, and we see jealousy being a real problem with everything. We have jealousy of groups of people who want land because others have it, so they just take it, for example. But jealousy is something that the human species can do without. So if you're watching this and you're reflecting back to your childhood to whatever degree, and you're saying, yeah, I can relate to that, well, know this, you're not alone. And all you have to do is survive life, survive jealousy. Anyway, just things to think about. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. The lone wolf character has been so romanticized and blown out of proportion as some sort of heroic moves of strength, where in reality the lone wolf perishes alone. Just remember, I was one man against many, fighting a losing battle, but I still fought to the end.
That means press on. That means endure. That means God cannot fail, and you're not going to give up. That's not an option for a child of God. This means you are going to be remembered. Listen to this and write it down if you can't remember it. You're never going to outgrow warfare. You simply must learn to fight. I hear people saying to me, oh, when is it going to get easier? When you die.